Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Be sure to follow us, by the way, on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. Twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. Joining us today on Uncommon Knowledge, two guests. A founder of the field of law and economics, Richard Epstein, is the director of the John M. Olin Program in Law and Economics at the University of Chicago and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. A former Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, John Taylor is a fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of economics at Stanford. Our topic, are we all Keynesians now? Gentlemen, to get us started, listen to this. Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Samuelson, last January, just about a year before his death, quote, "We see how utterly mistaken was the Milton Friedman notion that a market system can regulate itself. The Keynesian idea is once again accepted that fiscal policy and deficit spending have a major role to play in guiding a market economy. For now, just answer true or false."
False.
Richard?
Very false.
Excellent. We like the unambiguous here in Uncommon Knowledge. Segment one, a tale of 2 decades. Let's begin, John. Explain to me as a layman, as succinctly as possible, the difference between Friedman's approach and Keynes' approach. Those are the two leading personalities.
Friedman emphasized the advantages of free markets, the power of free markets, but also that you can control the ups and downs in the economy by controlling the money supply. Keynes, much more interventionist, emphasized the role of government and thought that fiscal policy interventions were necessary to stabilize the economy.
Okay, so Milton Friedman, whom you both knew, and
Yes. And
Milton Friedman, government, keep your hands off. Money supply should grow at some reasonable, more or less predictable rate.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
But now the key thing to understand about Milton's thing, this is a contribution which is not talking about how markets operates, but how governments ought to operate in order to make markets possible. And his basic view was that the less discretion you have in the way in which the money supply or in governments go, the easier it is for private actors to behave because the level of uncertainty which would otherwise interfere with private transactions is going to be reduced. So he is essentially, in political terms, a classical liberal who tries to find ways to take what might otherwise be discretionary public functions and turn them into ministerial ones, leaving the discretion on the private side.
Got it. Okay, now to 2 decades. Decade number one, unemployment at almost 8%, inflation at more than 14%, a typical home mortgage running at more than 20%, the economy contracting at an annual rate of more than 7%. And the date is late 1979. What caused the stagflation of the 1970s, John?
I think monetary policy just got behind the curve and let inflation pick up, stamped on the brakes, let inflation pick up again, stamped on the brakes. So you had a boom-bust cycle repeated
Monetary
several
policy.
times.
Give me this is very briefly the kind of infrastructure underlying that term monetary policy. The Federal Reserve in Washington does what?
It controls the money supply, which affects interest rates. We now think of the central bank as deciding what the interest rate will be. If they hold interest rates too low, inflation picks up, and then they have to raise interest rates, and that causes a recession.
Do you want to say exclusively money supply was out of whack during the 70s, or do you want to say the government expanded too much, or tax rates were wrong, or?
Well,
I would emphasize the monetary policy, but also there's fiscal policy, too much regulation. Those things are there too.
You're content to?
No, I have a slightly different take, which is I think all of these things are extremely important, but Carter was on all the sort of microeconomic issues something of an interventionist and a meddler. And he was a guy who favored various kinds of subsidy programs like synfuels. What happens is the great factors like monetary policy are always active. But if you mess up these second-tier factors, what they will do is they will exacerbate the situation. And that's what's going on today.
Okay, hold on. We'll get to today. But first, so we have the 70s. Now, our second decade is the 80s. By 1983, the economy begins to grow, inflation has fallen to the low single digits, unemployment is dropping, and for the rest of the decade, the economy grew briskly. Indeed, it continued to grow with only a couple of short, shallow recessions until 2008. So we see by the early 80s the beginnings of a quarter of a century of sustained growth, the biggest economic expansion in human history. What caused that?
Just the reverse of what caused the first part. Keeping inflation under control, prevented those booms and busts by monetary policy. We also reduced marginal tax rates significantly. The role of government was more predictable rather than more interventionist. Those were the things that I would point to as this.
Okay, so now what John is saying is what this layman thought, which is to say that the actual lived experience of recent American history enabled us to get someplace. We understood what to do, and in the 80s we did it. Clinton ratified most of it. You keep tax rates relatively low, you keep the money supply growing at a more or less predictable, modest rate, and things are fine, right?
Well, you also wanted to understand that Reagan was not in favor of new initiatives in regulation. There was also a vast improvement in antitrust period in that time when the ability to have private transactions without government interference started to increase. So both of these sides, the micro-regulation and the macro stuff, were in harmony. And Clinton, of course, was also favored by the fact that he had a Republican Congress, so that when he had initiatives going through, they were welfare reform and they were open trade with NAFTA and so forth, which tended to push the approach.
Can I just ask you then, would the two of you agree with the simple premise that between the 70s and the 80s and then the continued growth through the 90s, we actually we got as close to a control experiment as the social sciences ever can encounter, right?
I agree, 100%.
We actually got someplace, right?
Yes, I mean, look, I think what's so ironic about the Samuelson quote is that the dangers that took place in the second Bush administration is we started to unravel some of these things.
Okay.
Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, is a classic illustration of that.
All right, so which brings us, of course, to segment 2, what went wrong. Beginning in 2007, you've got housing values are starting to decline. Then last year, 2008, we get waves of defaults on subprime mortgages, which cause havoc in the financial system. Major banks collapse or nearly collapse. And a year later, we're still in a recession with unemployment at more than 10%.
Well,
what happened?
Well,
but I don't want your narrative first. I'm going to try out a couple of narratives that this layman has discovered in the popular press and have you comment on them. And then I'll get to your narrative, Richard. In particular, the text for this segment is John Cassidy's article in the first week of January 5th, as I recall, edition of The New Yorker, where John Cassidy, journalist, goes to the University of Chicago, Milton Friedman's intellectual home, and talks to some economists and to one non-economist, a fellow founder with you of the law and economics field, Judge Richard Posner. And Cassidy sums it up as follows, quote, largely as a result of misguided efforts to extend deregulation to the finance industry, we have experienced the biggest economic blow-up since the 1930s, close quote. Grade that
about
analysis.
a B minus C plus. And the explanation, I think, would be as follows. I do think they made one serious mistake.
Who's
which,
they?
In this case, it was Lawrence Summers and so forth and Robert Rubin. They got rid of the margin requirements under Bush with respect to various kinds of shadow banking transactions, and that probably was too risky. But the other features, which were much more important, were the way in which Fannie Mae and Freddie Mae, mark-to-market, all of which were government regulation. On the first part, what they did is they really juiced up the financial markets, both on the private and the public side. Cassidy noted, well, private banks are doing this as well, but they were under tremendous government pressure to make the kinds of loans that made no sense. And then in the end, the bubble burst for the traditional reasons. So my view about this period is that it's wrong to say it was a deregulatory period. It was a case in which Republicans lost faith with their previous views and the Democrats took over the ascendancy.
John, let me stay with Richard for one moment longer. I quote to you your friend, Richard Posner, now a federal judge, who earlier this year published a book called A Failure of Capitalism. Quote, we are learning that we need a more active and intelligent government to keep our model of a capitalist economy from running off the rails. Posner also, in an article in the New Republic, praised John Maynard Keynes' 1936 book, General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, quoting Posner, despite its antiquity, it is the best guide we have to the crisis, close quote. Now you, lawyer that you are, explicate for me Posner's position in making the strongest case for his position that you can.
Well, I mean, it goes back to the previous statement. If you treat the breakdown in the current system as being a failure of private institutions to equilibrate on matters of risk, then the only choice you have is government. Clearly, you don't want to have a dumb government, so you may as well have a smart government. And what Posner said in that article, which I regard as quite bizarre, is that the moment you engage in the stimulus-type activities, it shows that governments care. The way I look at it is you either have public or private creation of jobs. Governments will create a few jobs and destroy many more. Private people will create jobs that produce benefits. I mean, you could create jobs digging oil wells with spoons, and that's a job, but it gets you a higher rate of unemployment. So the prediction would be the more the stimulus you have, the higher the rate of unemployment.
John, in the first segment we said that between the 70s and the 80s, we actually feel we're getting someplace. We have this financial crisis, and quite a lot of members of your profession, economists, proved to my mind remarkably willing to toss Milton Friedman and the experience of a quarter of a century and more overboard. Case in point is Richard Posner, who had been a stout Friedmanite and monetarist before then. So can you, again, I want to get to your views obviously, but what is going on in their minds? What is the case that they see that causes them to toss what seems more than a quarter of a century of experience overboard?
I think that they're not realizing the big change that happened in policy. Very low interest rates, for example, by the Fed, didn't perceive that as early as other people did. They sort of saw this as a big recession and wanted to do fiscal policy instead, so they used that, we need something special. But I think they're wrong. I think it's basically if this pattern is so clear, bad policy in the 70s, not good results. Good policy in the 80s, 90s, good results. And then getting off track in the recent period, bad results.
Okay,
again.
so give me then, as tightly as you can, your analysis of what caused the financial crisis of '08 and continues to cause the recession today.
It got started with very low interest rates in 2002, 3, 4, much different than the kind of policies in the 80s and 90s. That stimulated and accelerated this housing boom and other risk-taking, and when it crashed, we basically had the defaults and the problems with the banks. It was accentuated by other government policies, in my view. Richard mentioned Fannie and Freddie as part of this, encouraging subprime mortgages, encouraging extra risk-taking. But I would go on as when things got really bad, we saw there was a problem in the banks. It was misdiagnosed as a liquidity problem, just pump more money and it would be fine. And then finally, in the real panic of 2008, really a lot of intervention, a lot of attempts to intervene with particular firms. And I think that scared people, caused the panic. Yeah. So those three things.
So let me see if you would both subscribe to this simple summary. We have essentially two competing narratives for what happened. And one narrative, to which Judge Posner seems to have subscribed, and Lord knows lots of the other economists have subscribed, is that in one way or another, the markets failed.
Well, let me give you an illustration.
Hold on. And the other narrative is, as John just suggested, the government messed it up. At a minimum, the government created the conditions through loose money that made the financial crisis much more likely, if not indeed probable. Go ahead.
Let me just say on this, because I think you say most economists. I mean, they just did a survey of economists who they were asked whether interest rates were too low in this period, whether there was too much ease in monetary, and they concluded there was. 75–80% were on the side this was too easy policy.
It's not clear which way that profession goes, but I want to mention one other factor which you haven't talked about.
Go ahead, Richard.
Which is, once these mortgages are underwater, what do you do with them? And the correct response is to allow the banks to make the choice between foreclosure on the one hand and renegotiation on the other. In many cases, the people who bought these premises paid very little down, and a foreclosure is nothing more dramatic than being told that you can't renew your lease. The moment you keep these mortgages alive, the property prices can't go back down to their natural levels. The properties deteriorate under the management, and banks thinking about future loans will recognize that if they can't be sure that they can get their money back in the terms that they want, they won't lend. And so these policies, in effect, at the micro level, have made it clear that it's much wiser for a bank, which could borrow very cheaply from the Fed, to lend it back to the Fed at a higher rate. So you're not going to get any kind of lending unless and until you strengthen the guarantee. So the market failure I'm talking about is the complete disruption of the mortgage market, which has been done through all sorts of government regulations. Okay. Always a failure.
Okay. On to segment 3, which is to take the analysis down to one deeper level of specificity or granularity. The Cassidy article quotes Gary Becker, who, be it noted, has not departed from his views that the free market is a much better force for growth than government intervention, as saying this, quote, a major cause of the crisis, Becker, excuse me, I'm quoting Cassidy, but he's referring to Becker. A major cause of the crisis, Becker said, was that Wall Street financial engineers devised a series of new instruments that neither they nor the people who traded them fully understood. Close quote. Even granting the arguments that the two of you have made so far, isn't that, from Gary Becker, friend and apostle of Milton Friedman and himself a Nobel Prize winner, isn't this a serious problem for a free market analysis?
Yes.
That here you have highly intelligent, very well-paid people doing things that are not in their interest. The entire market on Wall Street, as regards these collateralized mortgage obligations and the credit defaults, that all got screwed up. The market did screw up, right?
I think that you have to think of where the government was going into this. You know, I mentioned Fannie and Freddie as encouraging the origination of such mortgages in the first place. And then you have to think about, we had this sense of what would the government do if there was a problem. And I think the expectation the government would come in and bail out, as in fact they did, reduce the efforts that people made to look at the complexity of these instruments. Plus, we were helping the rating agencies by giving them specific endorsement on the government side. So I think it was a lot of things. I want to say people make mistakes in the private sector every day. There's firms in this Silicon Valley where we're sitting, firms fail. It's the nature of capitalism. It doesn't always work. But in this case, you had this rather large effort by the government.
I'm a 27-year-old quant jock on Wall Street getting paid $750,000 a year with a doctorate from MIT and maybe did a master's at Chicago. And I say, wow, fiddling with my computer, my Bloomberg, there are ways of slicing and dicing these mortgages. We can create entirely new products. And then I go to my risk control officer, and the risk control officer says to himself, at some level, he either senses this or he understands it explicitly, money is loose. The government is encouraging Freddie and Fannie to create and sustain a market in subprime mortgages, meaning the whole mortgage market is going wild. And if we do screw up, somehow or other, the government will save us.
The implicit guarantee.
Is that correct? And that's correct. And so he says to the 27-year-old quant jock, do it. Go ahead, I don't care. The risk is, right?
I think the implicit guarantee is one of the issues. I also think that there are other issues. The question as to how you value these things depends not only on the evaluations at the time that they're put together, but it's what happens to these notes after these pools are formed. So if you change the regulation that deals, for example, with foreclosure, the properties of the notes 6 months into these deals is very different from the ones that they were before. And so again, it's the question of anything that you do with respect to an underlying interest will work its way through all of these things. The second problem, which I think is a technical one, which people won't make again, is I think they were implicitly using normal distributions with very low probabilities at the tails. And in a world of high degrees of government regulation, essentially you have to assume that something which is 4 standard deviations from the median is going to be more likely to happen than it would have been in an unregulated situation.
So they got the risk profiles of these.
Well, that's it, in part because
Richard,
they don't understand.
Let me return to you, though. You said earlier, in our previous segment, you said when the mortgages start to go underwater, the correct response is to leave it to the banks to make the decision whether to foreclose or renegotiate. But that's part of the point. Nobody could figure out who held these mortgages.
Well,
these things have been sliced and diced and sold away from your local home savings and loan through some huge instrument. You could end up with Hong Kong, some bank in Hong Kong holding, right? So how do you renegotiate?
No. What happens is when they do these syndications in the first place, what happens is you create somebody who does have the powers for renegotiation. But what they did is they underpowered that process, and they overpowered the rights to withdraw as an effort to induce people to come in. The next generation of these transactions will cut down on the withdrawal rights, and they will improve the degree of control for renegotiation.
Yes, of course.
On the regulation issue, I mean, there was lots of regulations out there that weren't being enforced very well. Think about the banks, the most heavily regulated part of our financial system. And then you had these toxic assets or these off-balance sheet vehicles, which the regulators didn't bring attention to. So it seems to me if you want to think about regulation as a problem, it was the laws on the books were not being enforced properly, and that's the worst thing you do.
So
you don't know what the rules are.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it's the uncertainty that introduces into the marketplace, that the bankers don't know what they're going to...
But what can they get away with? Then, of course, you have people who are investing in the banks thinking they're being regulated, and they're not being regulated properly. I think that's a very serious problem.
And also the rating issues are very serious. If you have monopoly rating, it can cause these problems.
One more argument that it strikes me as a layman represents a problem for the free market analysis is this notion of systemic risk. Again, Cassidy quotes Gary Becker as saying that we, the University of Chicago, and Gary says, I, Gary Becker, did not understand the nature of the systemic risk.
Yes, well, that is true.
That is the way to say the way these instruments got in everybody's portfolios. So when one card goes down, or one domino goes down, it knocks down all these institutions at once, right?
This is true, yes, but the problem about it is the source of the systemic risk private panic, or is it government regulation? And the mark-to-market type features, which says that you have to reevaluate your portfolio and liquidate some portion of it under circumstances where you don't meet standard requirements, were both government regulations and on private side, and what it did is it created just that cascade. Selling to a market only makes sense if it's randomized. The moment the risks are highly correlated, nobody will buy because they know if you're selling today, it's going to lower the market, which means that somebody else is going to be in default tomorrow, which means you may as well wait. And this cycle essentially went all the way down until you got to the last stage where the only person who could buy would be the government because they didn't have to mark to market.
I think the systemic risk point is ill-defined and can be used to encourage government intervention when it's not needed. So I don't agree with Gary in this respect.
Give me an example of how it could be used.
Well, I could
financial firm, say Bear Stearns, way back in the spring of 2008, says our creditors are not going to be taken care of, so they're going to pull their money out of other banks. We got to save Bear Stearns without any evidence.
Okay.
Or even take Lehman. Lehman did go through bankruptcy, and it was viewed as one of the sources of the panic. When I look at the data, that was not really where things got worse. It was later when the government intervened and I think scared people.
So a shrewd banker, some big shot on Wall Street, can call Tim Geithner's successor at the New York Fed and scare him to death using the systemic risk argument.
It's like calling for a fire, but we know what fire is, we don't know what
Let
systemic
me give you another illustration.
Okay,
There is
quickly on this one, Richard.
something known as the Miller-Moore Amendment, which is being proposed, which with respect to the short-term repo market, overnight loans, is going to allow the government to give it a haircut. That will wreck that particular market. It is a classic form of potential systemic risk, but it's through government regulation, which affects all of these bonds.
Okay, segment 4, how did we do? Let's grade our leaders. In this case, at the moment of the credit catastrophe, so we're talking about autumn of 2008 here. George W. Bush, before leaving office, he signs into law the $700 billion Troubled Asset Relief Program, or TARP.
The main problem with the TARP, in my view, was the clumsy, chaotic rollout, where the chairman of the Fed and the secretary of the Treasury asked for $700 billion, just 2.5 pages of draft legislation, no discussion of oversight, lots of criticism from the Congress, and that actually, I think, just made it clear to people that there really wasn't a plan. It wasn't a way to deal with this. It took for three weeks, the S&P 500 nosedives by 28%.
Were you shocked that at the time of the crisis, Treasury Secretary Paulson and Fed Chairman Bernanke seemed so obviously to be improvising? That is to say, we believe, at least I suppose, I like to believe that the Pentagon has in file drawers across the building war plans for all kinds of contingencies. The housing market had been sinking for months, and Bernanke and Paulson don't seem to have am I right about that?
I'm surprised. The more I read about it and talk to people, I'm continuing to be surprised because I think really by the summer of 2007, it was clear there were problems in these financial institutions. But here we are into September 2008. And
so thank you, that satisfies my curiosity on that point, but you think it was the right thing to do to enact a $700 billion emergency program? It was just clumsily deployed?
Well, who knows, quite frankly, because maybe you couldn't do it without the clumsy deployment. But the clumsy deployment to me was really the thing that I saw causing all the damage.
Clumsiness in execution is always a problem, but compared to what? And can you actually devise a program of that size and that magnitude which would be well run? And I think the answer really is that every legislative action that you think about is going to take weeks, perhaps months to implement. And every changes in the financial markets at this point were taking hours in order to take place. So you're always chasing your own tail at these times, and you'll never be able to come out correctly. What made the TARP thing even worse, ironically, was that it was not a clear financial bill. The first round was a very simple bill, right? We buy these assets and destabilize it. By the time you got the thing through, a week later, it was several hundred pages, and you were doing multiple things at one time or another. And this is going to also detract from market confidence.
The markets are reacting minute by minute by minute, whereas the government is moving at the rate of a day at a time or a week at a time. So the correct solution would have been to do nothing?
Well, I don't know about that.
I think the correct solution would be to go back at the time of Bear Stearns and say this intervention took place. What's next? There was no description of what the policy would be in the case of another institution. So that would have been the point.
So
to
Dick
lay
Fuld,
out
who was running Lehman, had a point when he said, "Hey, wait a minute! You guys saved Bear Stearns.
Absolutely.
Why aren't you coming? Why aren't you?"
They all thought they would be there. The government there. That whole weekend needs to be studied. They brought everybody to the New York Fed, and they tried to find a way for the private sector
But it's
to bail them
also,
out.
remember, when Bear Stearns went down, it was very complicated because its assets were revalued sharply downward by Goldman Sachs, which had some sort of proprietary, oversight role. So using banker against banking. And one of the things, therefore, that you worry about is if an institution, at least in the short run, is cash flow positive. They were not actually hemorrhaging cash at that particular point.
They could have opened for business on Monday morning. They had the cash,
There's
right?
a real issue as to whether or not, when these regulations come in, they are stopping what is going to be a disastrous failure 2 weeks later when it turns out the cash runs out, or whether they're creating that particular element.
And the answer from both of these very sophisticated minds is we don't know.
Well, I mean, my guess in Bear Stearns is that they would have been able to weather the storm if they had gone out there, and if the government had sort of pulled back on this stuff. But what happens is, this is where the private foreclosure stuff takes place. At the same time this is going on, you get all sorts of efforts to say we have to prevent people from being tossed out of their homes. That may do wonders on one side of the market, but it's going to roil these pools on the other.
Ben Bernanke, at the time of the crisis, the Fed chairman at the time of the crisis, floods the system with liquidity. As best I've been able to tell, you get the biggest, most rapid expansion of the money supply in American history in the autumn of 2008. Grade that move. That was the right thing to do or not?
I think the right thing to do was to get interest rates down, which they took a while to do, but they did. But the extra amount of provision of liquidity, I don't see that as necessary, especially since it's still in the system. I think maybe put in a little bit as they did back at the time of 9/11 attacks, but then pull it out. But now we're stuck with a huge amount of excess liquidity in the economy, which has to be pulled out.
Okay, so tell me again, here's the layman's understanding. Milton Friedman argued that the proximate cause of the Great Depression of the 1930s was the Federal Reserve. It permitted some rather routine runs on banks to become a nationwide epidemic because it failed to support the banks by expanding the money supply.
Well, they had
One
deflationary
correction
pressure.
on
get
that.
that wrong?
He complained, along with Anna Schwartz, that the money supply declined.
Actually declined. So you get a
It's
sharp
declined. It's
contraction.
a contraction. And we're never talking about a contraction in this case. It was
Oh,
really
we're
an
not?
expansion.
No, huge
blow-up,
expansion in
if
the-
you like.
Yeah.
So another way to think about it, just keep the money supply from declining. Get interest rates down rather than just explode the money supply. I think.
And the Fed has the tools to do that
Absolutely.
hour by hour and night by night?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
that you can find too.
Oh, really?
So, I mean, on the money,
hadn't
that's
frankly, I hadn't
So the
realized
counterfactual is, suppose the money supply had been held constant or not increased so much. And I
So
think
what the newspapers would run every morning was the overnight spread on overnight money.
That's LIBOR.
And the LIBOR, that rate expanded dramatically.
That's because
the Fed could have just closed that right back up.
that has to do with the risk with the banks.
This is essentially a measure of the uncertainty with respect to overnight transactions. And as that number goes up, it suggests that somebody's going to tank. And so it's a sign of internal instability. Let me give you the other source.
But I just want to understand, so what you're talking about is you keep the Fed funds rate level, and you see the way banks are lent. So commercial, you look at the usual, but you don't look at the overnight, which is banks getting.
Well, no,
Because
the
the
whole
overnight
credit
was
system-
always low. It's
Yeah.
these longer, 3-month is what
Well,
LIBOR
you
is.
hope
It's a
to
longer
do-
maturity. And those went up starting in 2007. And
But isn't the overnight spread where you saw the banks suddenly becoming aware of everybody was holding bad paper,
That
but
was
nobody
in
knew how
August
much?
2007.
Oh, I'm sorry.
August
Okay.
2007,
Okay.
There's a
those
different,
spreads jumped.
the spreads jump is a sign of the integrity of the system. And the question is, what happens when you flood the system with money? Well, you know you're going to have to bail it out, or there will be an inflation time somewhere there. The question is, if these guys are putting it in this inept fashion, how good are they going to be to take it out? So you run a very odd financial system in which you have simultaneous risks of deflation and inflation on a timing situation. And so what do people do? They tend to pull back from long-term commercial transactions. That slows up the new real estate market. That slows up the hiring market. At the same time, you get labor regulation and pension regulation and healthcare regulation that's being proposed, which make that market more precarious. So you get major contractions in real estate, major contractions in labor. The stimulus program addresses none of the microeconomic stuff on this, and you see the current situation emerging. I mean, neoclassical theory explains it pretty well.
Segment 5, our final segment, continuing to grade the main actors here. The first year of Obama. And you just raised this, you gave us the danger of, let me just put it, Ben Bernanke, we just discussed how the Fed chairman behaved during the crisis. During the past year, he's keeping interest rates low, and he's purchased about $1.5 trillion in longer-term Treasury bonds and housing agency securities, which is an expansion in the money supply that former OMB director David Stockman called, quote, an unprecedented exercise in market rigging with printing press money, a truly insane monetary policy. John?
Keeping interest rates down is fine, but these interventions into particular markets, whether it's mortgages, whether it's AIG, that's the troublesome part. And I don't agree with that. And my studies show it's really not the right thing to have done. I say at least now stop doing that and pledge not to do it in the future.
And so, question. Bernanke and the Fed have been arguing in recent weeks that Congress is putting them under undue political pressure. Could it not be argued that Bernanke has made the Fed an instrument of fiscal policy rather than monetary policy? He has become a political actor.
Well, I think by doing fiscal policy or credit allocation, it's taking the Fed into areas where one can question the need for independence. That is fiscal policy. That's something where you'd like to have.
Last question for John, and then to you, Richard. So the last question is, can the Fed, let's assume that Ben Bernanke is reconfirmed by the time this program airs. He's going to be voted on, they say, before the end of his term on January 31st. So let's assume he's reconfirmed. Is he going to be able to back out the extra money out of the system without an inflationary run?
I think it's going to be hard. I hope he does. That's what they say they'll do. So let's take them at their word, but also watch what happens.
Richard? Okay.
I'm always a doubter on this stuff, but I don't think it's just him. I think, in fact, what's happened is the political side of this has turned worse. After the shellacking that the Democrats took in Massachusetts, many people, myself included, thought they would pull in their horns and move back towards the median voter. What they've done is they've made themselves sound more populist, and the way in which they express their populism is to go after banker salaries, which, if there ever were a diversion to this larger question, that one turns out to be it, that is executive compensation. And the lead in the stock market decline in the past week was, of course, the banks, because the kinds of regulations and taxes that are going to be imposed upon them bear no relationship, as best I can see, to anything other than the mode of political vengeance. If you've paid off your loans, don't treat these guys as implicit guarantors of the loans that were made by other banks, which have yet to repay their loans. And yet we see this regimen of high taxation, which has one key consequence, and I'll just end with that. The more you tax these highly rapid markets, the lower the liquidity, the less accurate the pricing, the more the instability that will take place on all public exchanges, both credit and debt. I mean, both debt and equity.
To President Obama himself, Richard.
God help.
All right, now to John. Obama, in this first year of Obama, $800 billion so-called stimulus bill. I'm putting stimulus in quotation marks because so little of it was targeted at anything that, as best I can tell, most economists believe could have stimulated growth.
It's all in capital expenditures that weren't made. This
and
is
also
brilliant.
spread out. After the first year, only a third of it at most has been spent. An increase in the federal debt of about $1 trillion, and the Congressional Budget Office projects adding $1 trillion a year to the debt for the next decade. The takeover of two of the three big three American car companies, and a direct government role in the biggest banks. John, grade the chief executive for his first year.
Not a good record. In fact, it's very worrisome to me. We're going in the wrong direction. We talked about some of the interventions at the end of the Bush administration. It's just much more. The stimulus package, I can't see that it's doing any good. We're increasing the debt, we're intervening more. We have kind of a bailout mentality that's continuing. So I hope this recent election in Massachusetts begins to get people thinking.
Okay, you two are both observers of the intersection of politics and economics. And here's what I do not get. We have, as we began the program by noting, lived experience of recent American history. The 70s went badly, the 80s and 90s and the first part of the noughts went extremely well. We know the policy that typified the 70s. We know the policy of deregulation and lower taxes and relatively stable money expansion. So we know that. We know that. And then you get the public swinging against Obama and the government intervention. And yet, as Richard pointed out, the president and the Democrats who still control both houses of Congress seem to be doubling down on the government intervention. What is going on? And where is your profession? We're
going to keep talking. We're out there. Thanks for having us on.
I think what's happened essentially is they don't believe that they will be credible if they move back to the middle. They have their own constituents like Andy Stern and the labor movements and so forth who are pushing them very far. I think
Andy Stern is?
He's the head of the SEIU, the Service Employees International Union, who has been pushing the Employee Free Choice Act, which is another real potential killer with respect to labor markets.
Okay, go ahead.
Different shows, different point. But what I'm saying, in effect, is the base to which he is most accountable is to the left of the center, and they regard themselves as going to be completely shut out if he moves to the center. So they would rather take the risk of his getting blown out of the water so long as they have the chance of winning. They know they lose for certain if he goes back to the middle. This way, at least, they have a fighting chance.
This political analysis strikes you as correct?
You know, I just want to say this. It seems that what we're seeing in the politics here is a great concern in the American public for the way the country is going on economic grounds. The debt and the problems of the debt is ranked higher. The unemployment is still very high. So people are not happy with these policies. And that, I think, is a good sign for our democracy. And regardless of where the economists are weighing in on various things, remember the Friedman-Schwartz analysis of the Great Depression occurred 30 years after the Great Depression. And in the meantime, there was lots of thinking that FDR-style policies is what brought us out. So it takes a while. That's why, as I say, thanks for having us on.
So you stand with Thomas Jefferson. Over time, place your faith in the American people.
Absolutely.
Well, I hope that that's correct. I certainly put my faith in the original constitutional design, which is small government, limited powers, relatively strong markets, and flat taxation. And Obama, for example, on the tax front, one of the real costs is you have tax rates scheduled for going to effect next year and efforts to put surtaxes on part of it. This has tremendous adverse effects on long-term investment.
John, last word. Give me one sentence of advice that you would offer to the President of the United States if you could.
Don't raise taxes this year.
Richard?
Amen.
Amen. Richard Epstein?
And no new regulatory initiatives, period.
Period. Richard Epstein, John Taylor, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us. Be sure to take a look at us on Twitter at twitter.com/UNC Knowledge. For Uncommon Knowledge, thanks.